Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cubs on Deck. This is Greg Zumach. I'm flying solo today, but it's a topic that I'm passionate about. We're talking MLB Draft. Now, if you follow us, and hopefully you do follow us on Twitter, follow us on YouTube, Cubs on Deck, you know that we're going to focus a bit on the Cubs, right? I mean, this is Cubs on Deck. This is what we talk about. But I also like to dive into things that are a little bit broader. And so we're going to be talking about the MLB draft in general. I kicked out some questions, asked some audience members, and to try to get some sense for what are people thinking about the draft? What are the questions that they're having? Don't say that I have all the answers, but hopefully we can dive into that. Today is a fantastic day. I just finished covering for Northside Bound, which is a fantastic Cubs site that focuses on the MILB side, so the minor league side, the prospects, along with the draft. Covered the Big Ten tournament championship. Was a great experience. Loved it. It's my second year covering it. A little bit more in depth this year now that I kind of knew what I was doing. And we got to see some incredible draft prospects. Some that may have some Cubs implications. I don't know, but I came away very impressed with several of them. So we're going to get to a few of those, talk about some of those prospects, talk about maybe some of the pro development plans, all prepping for an article that I'll have here on Northside Bound very soon with my recap of the Big Ten championship. Along with, after that, let's talk Cubs and MLB draft prospects. And in general, kind of dig into some of the listener questions, try to get into a few areas that are beyond just who are the Cubs going to take in the first round. I don't have the answer for that, but let's talk about a few different individuals and who are some day three guys to kind of pay attention to. Some of those fun things, I think we're going to really enjoy it. But like I mentioned, let's talk about the Big Ten championship. If you are in the Midwest or you happen to be a Midwest college baseball fan, you may have already heard that the Nebraska Cornhuskers, won their first Big Ten tournament championship. That's a very exciting time for them. I covered the Big Ten tournament championship at this Charles Schwab Field, which is actually where the College World Series will be held here in a couple weeks. It was a lot of fun. I covered many of the teams that were there, not all of them. I didn't get to a Michigan game, but otherwise was able to cover all of the other teams. Came away with a few of the draft prospects that I thought were really interesting. A few of the folks that really caught my eye, Cade Obermuller, who is a left-handed pitcher out of Iowa, is really interesting. So he came into the draft cycle, so to speak. People were talking about him in August, September, October of last year. And, he was getting some like trendy first round, second round buzz. Is a really intriguing lefty, very low slot. And so he throws it from a really low angle. And, ultimately it's going to add to some complexity within the arsenal. For one, he's very challenging from the left-handed pitcher perspective, like very, very challenging. But it also adds to some areas with some command issues. So we already can see that there's some command issues, and we certainly saw it for the season. He also throws this really, excuse me, so sorry, throws a really impressive slider. For a left-handed hitter, very challenging. So we see fastball, we see slider, very challenging for lefties, definitely some command issues. Tinkers with the splitter. I'm intrigued. I don't think he's first, second round type of guy, but somebody that you take deeper on day two, try to work within your development system. If you told me that he developed into like a really impressive left-handed reliever with a chance to start at the next level, I could totally buy that. So I tend to like Cade Obermuller a lot. I think he's kind of an interesting guy. Another one that I came away maybe not impressed, but intrigued, was Connor Foley. He's a right-handed pitcher out of Indiana. Big-time stuff, good velocity, got about 30% whiff rate on his fastball for the season, a workable slider, really nice pitching development build. So stands 6'5", weighs 230, mid-90s fastball. You can work with the breaking ball. Command kind of came and went, especially, during the outing that I saw him. But at the end of the day, like, if you were to try to build up like show what like an ideal day 2 type of pick would be for pitching development staff to try to build and develop, and somebody who all of a sudden, like 2 years from now, like just totally popped in Double-A, Connor Foley is that type of arm. So I came away pretty impressed with him in general, just at like the raw building blocks that he showed. Another one I'm going to jump in on, because then we're going to get to your listener questions. You can't possibly go the entire time talking about the Big Ten tournament championship, without talking about Josh Caron. Catcher out of Nebraska. He went nuclear. And like, I don't want to say that lightly. This guy, he was the most outstanding performer of the tournament. He was, you don't want to say single-handedly responsible for Nebraska winning the championship, but heavily responsible. He hit 6 home runs. I think I saw 4 of them in person. Was a monster, just an absolute monster. For folks who don't know, Charles Schwab Field, I used to be called TD Ameritrade, where the College World Series is stationed, is not a hitter's park. It is very challenging to hit home runs. Not that they don't happen, they definitely happen. But when you hit a ball, there really aren't cheapies. And even if you do, get in like the first or second, rows of bleachers, that's still pretty impressive. Josh Caron hit balls to the concourse. They were, 433 and 432 feet, with exit velocities of like 112, 110. Hit another one for 109. Incredibly impressive. He was unbelievable. There are some questions with regard to what he can do from the catcher side. I still have some questions, but I'm overall pretty encouraged. I would put probably like a 3rd or 4th round grade on him, with maybe some upside for more. But count me in the believers of somebody that's really, really interested in what Josh Caron can do. Other guys I'm going to feature here in the Northside Bound write-up is going to be Tyler Cerny. A big fan of Tyler Cerny. He's a shortstop out of Indiana. Really interesting kind of dude. Somebody that's a little bit more of a deeper pick. He has some big fans on the 1060 West Discord. There's a lot of Cerny fans there. So, I think there's a few other guys that I want to highlight. Got a chance to check out Brody Brecht a little bit, but not the full outing, unfortunately. Looked good, is throwing, 3 pitches. Some big questions. We'll talk about Brecht here in a little bit. Jackson Brockett out of Nebraska is really interesting. He's a guy that not big velo, maybe some workable traits. A guy that really is just starting to kind of pop a little bit. Was fantastic in the tourney. Kind of an interesting guy. A 2025 guy to dig in is to Devin Taylor. He is his corner outfield. He'll play some left field, some right field for Indiana. 2025 guy, really impressive hitter. Weirdly pulled during the tournament, during one of the games, even when it was tight. So I'm not quite sure about that. Won't speculate too much, but really interesting. So that was my experience at the Big Ten. Great experience. Loved it. If you have a chance to go, I really, really recommend it. It was a fantastic venue for it, and certainly was completely popping with folks from the Nebraska area who were there to support the Huskers. We had 13,000 people there today. Most other days aren't quite that big, but in a stadium that can fit 29,000, still plenty of room for people to kind of stretch out. It was really a great experience. So Highly, highly enjoy that. Let's dig into some listener questions, though, because that's what you sent me. That's what I'm excited to dig into. So, our first question, let's jump in. Thank you to Michael Eddy, and thank you to everybody who sent in questions here. But Michael Eddy asks, any chance the Cubs could get Carson Wiggins in the draft? For folks who think that name sounds familiar, you are on the right track. This is Jackson Wiggins' younger brother. He's down in Oklahoma, like where his brother was. I could see it. He profiles as a guy that's very similar to Jackson, which is premier stuff, some questions on control and command. Ultimately, I would guess that he goes to college. I think that that's probably the best route for him. But if you told me that the Cubs saw him on an amazing day and felt like, you know what, we can do exactly what we did with Jackson, which is kind of slowly build and work and develop and try to isolate some of these command and control issues, take a gamble, so to speak, on the stuff. He's certainly the type of guy that would profile in that second to third round range, certainly for an overslot, but an area where, again, you're gambling on stuff, betting on that stuff. So certainly would be a ton of fun if they took Carson Wiggins. Wouldn't anticipate it, but I could see that happen. Like I could see the possibility of that happening. The next question I want to jump in on is from Jack, Cubs fan. Jack, thank you very much. He said, who are the top 5 players that you want the Cubs to draft that are realistic, right? I'm not going to jump into Travis Bazzana and Charlie Condon, any of those guys that are certainly not going to be down at 14 and available. I'll toss out my first one, who is somebody that you've heard me talk about a lot, which is Trey Savage. He's a right-handed pitcher out of East Carolina. We are towing the lines of who's going to be realistically available. I was calling for Trey Savage in like December when I came on a mock draft with I think it was the Locked On MLB Prospects account, which was a ton of fun. At the time, Trey Savage was like a borderline first rounder, and now he's a guy that probably doesn't make it out of the top 12, 13. I still think if he's there, he should be somewhat realistically considered. He would be a natural fit for the Cubs. I've been calling for it. I love it. I love the profile. I think it's an easy fit. Do I anticipate that he ends up there? Unfortunately, no. But I think as long as he's healthy, he likely won't be there. But we should still talk about him. He's still a great fit. He's still maybe somewhat in that range. Weird stuff happens in the MLB draft too, as well. So Trey Savage. The next one is Cam Smith. He's a third baseman out of FSU, Florida State University. Love the profile. Hit well on the Cape. Looks like he should stick at third. Really improved where he was from a contact perspective, improved where he was from a chase perspective. That's probably the biggest one for him. Still hits with some juice. I really like Cam Smith a lot. I think he's a good fit. He's probably somewhere in that range. You'll hear some analysts kind of keep popping up different guys saying like, this person shouldn't make it out of the top 10 or 12. The more people they do that, eventually we're just going to reach a point where there's more than 14 or 15 of those guys. And I think that's where we are with Cam Smith. It is very possible that he doesn't make it out of the top 10, but also you add in his teammate like James Tibbs. You add in, other guys like Carson Bench, who I'm going to talk about as they shouldn't make it out of the top 10 or 12. And we really get to a point where eventually some of them have to be there, right? And so Cam Smith is probably in that range of somewhere in that 10 to 15 range. Great fit for the Cubs if he can make it. I hope he does. I think that'd be a lot of fun. Carson Bench, like I talked about, he came into the season as a two-way guy, still does two-way. Actually recently just pitched pretty well on the mound. Mid-90s velocity. But for me, outfielder all the way. Love his profile. He doesn't chase the ball out of the zone. He makes good contact. And he'll show some juice, too. Let me pull up some of his numbers here. Overall, pretty solid. There are some questions about whether his max exit velocity is actually truly accurate. So I don't want to get into that too much. But, 90th percentile is about 106. His average exit velocity is 93. There are some questions within the analytic circles about how a useful average exit velocity is. And I tend to agree. But, I mean, all things considered, you'd rather it be up there. And so Carson Bench looked pretty good. He played a limited amount of time with the Wood Bat League last summer. Not much. Looked fine. I think looked overall okay. Didn't pop a bunch of homers or anything, but didn't strike out a ton. So really like Carson Bench. And then Cash Mayfield, left-handed pitcher. He's a prep. And I know that's going to be really, really interesting. And folks are going to be maybe a tad surprised by that. But the Cubs haven't leaned into the prep pitching side from a first rounder in a while. And there are some good reasons for that. There are certainly some questions with regard to what does this guy ultimately look like at the next level? What's the transferability on it? All of those are very valid. I tend to still think the Cash Mayfield looks really good. Very smooth mechanics. Looked amazing at the Super 60, which is a kind of a prep showcase in February in Chicago. Looked really impressive. I think he's a good fit there. And I think what the Cubs could do with him, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is kind of build a draft class around him where you mitigate some of that risk, but you bank in on some of that upside. And you did ask for a fifth one, and I got to admit, I've been racking my brain on, like, who do I really, really want? And the first four guys are the guys that I think I would lean in on. But, along those same lines, there's also a couple preps. And I think where I lean on this is I'd be very, very intrigued if they actually went with a guy like Cam Caminiti, who's also a prep lefty. And I do prefer Cash Mayfield, but there are teams that have Cam Caminiti. His cousin is Ken Caminiti. So if you've heard the name, that's certainly where it's jogging your memory, who are very high on him. I'm honestly not sure if the Cubs are one of those teams, but he certainly fits the profile of a guy who could really, really pop in professional ball. Where he's challenged is he's not spinning the ball very well. That ultimately isn't a death knell for him, and he's very young. He was supposed to be in the 2025 draft, reclassified to 2024. So in many ways, he's almost like just a high school junior. And so if you wanted to look at that and say, yeah, hey, like, we can work on that. We can work on certain finger techniques, spinning off the ball. We can work on different intention, perhaps, or grip focuses. If you feel like you're in an organization that can do that, maybe he never reaches plus spin, but it still looks in general like the foundation of a guy who you could really believe in. Tons of athleticism as well. Is a two-way guy, but his future's on the mound. He'd be really, really interesting. And the more I think about it, the more I'd love to kind of gamble on some of that upside, because it is certainly there with Cam Caminiti. Jumping into our next question from Next Up MILB. That's a great tagline there. Our account handle has Christian Moore played himself into the first round. And this is an interesting one because depending on who you talk to, Christian Moore has impressed a lot of folks, but there's definitely still some question marks. So for folks who don't know, he's second baseman in Tennessee. There's still some defensive questions for it. Big time power. I think what he's showed you is that it's a lot of juice. Where we're sitting, though, is that there are still some questions on contact rate, so the amount of whiffs, the contact he generates, as well as the chase rate. He's sitting there at a chase rate that's very similar to where Matt Shaw was, so, that's not overwhelmingly concerning, but also his contact rate is more playable than anything else. He's making decent contact in the zone, but overall is still less than 80%, which is not ideal. But the question is, Does he make it in the first round? And I would say yes. I think that does still end up happening there. Because when we start talking about the first round, you're talking about a guy very similar to like Matthews, who was drafted last year in the first round. I think could certainly be an easy argument to be made. You're gambling on the upside, you're gambling on power. Still fits very, very well. So I would say he sneaks into at least top 35 picks because there's going to be some variability. And sometimes teams will actually buy a guy down, that would be a first round caliber. But certainly, I think that Christian Moore is in that first round discussion, let's say top 35, top 36 picks. All right, moving on to our next question. We have one that, I kind of teased a little bit here. Do you think there's a good chance the Cubs draft Brody Brecht? This is by Chicago sports fans. Brody Brecht is a guy that I've spent a lot of time trying to think about. I'm not sure. I could see him being somebody that the Cubs would consider. Brecht has unbelievable stuff. It's a tremendous amount of velocity. So it's not even actually the best fastball, but certainly the velo helps, right? Like this is a guy that regularly pumps, 98 to 102. There was some question about whether he was pumping 104 last year or earlier. And I think that's been soundly disproven that it wasn't actually 104, but this is a guy that's upper 90s, low 100s, definitely where the velo is helping. Not the best fastball shape, but at the end of the day, like it's still obviously impressive velocity. The sliders is really where he makes his money, though, because he's got some very impressive sliders that he works with. One being a bit more of like a gyro slider, so, straight down movement. The other being a little bit more of a sweeper, a little bit newer. This is some impressive stuff that he'll show. He reminds me a lot of Hurston Waldrop, where there is very significant command and control concerns, but also some really premier stuff. Could I see Brody Brecht being maybe on the Cubs board to where they talk about like an underslot deal, something around like the $4 million range, which would be 80% of slot, about top 20 money? Yeah, I could see that, very similar to what Hurston Waldrop did last year. But I also could see Brecht being a guy that really would pop if he went to the right type of spot. And that would be a team like the Braves, with Waldrop, Dodgers, a couple of these other teams that are just, really ideal landing spots, I think, to ultimately develop him. I think if I was drafting Brecht for the Cubs, I would do that exact same strategies, which is, excuse me, you try to give him an underslot deal so that you kind of mitigate risk elsewhere in the draft. And by giving him, maybe saving like $1 million off of slot, and I have no idea what Brody Brecht's ask is by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just trying to approximate based on like what I would do there. If you were to save about a million off of slot, from 5 million to 4 million approximately, you could then use that money down at pick 54, which would end up giving you about 2.6 million, or even including your extra money from your overslot percentage, so like your extra 5%, you should get very close to about $3 million. So you could get a first round caliber player at 54 by taking a bit of a gamble at 14 with Brody Brecht. It's an interesting route to go. I don't know if the Cubs are really heavily in on him. Maybe they've seen all the information they have. I'm not sure. I have no clue how the Cubs feel about Brody Brecht. But if you were going to take that route, that risk, that's probably the way that I would go about it. Moving on to our next couple questions here from Kevin Gahala. Sorry about that. He says, who do you think the Cubs are targeting with their 19th round selection? And then says, but seriously, and asks another question. Well, I will give you a day 3 pick. I don't know if they're targeting him, but this is the type of guy that I would look at. Liberty University left-hander Garrett Horn. He hasn't pitched since March. You always worry about an injury history there. I'm not going to speculate, but he hasn't pitched since then. Was a workhorse starter for Liberty University, even impressive as a freshman. He was a guy that was in my top 3 to 5 range entering the season. Big fan of Garrett Horn. The Cubs have taken a chance. Let's say there is an injury history. Again, I don't know. They've taken that type of gamble on day 3. That would be a type of guy and just an all-around great dude to try to gamble on and see if he could come back healthy regardless. Whenever he's throwing, I'm a big Garrett Horn fan. I liked him in the 2022 draft, I believe. I guess 2021. Really like him a lot. I've liked him for a while. I think he's a great profile. A guy that probably builds out his arsenal at the pro side regardless, wherever he ends up. But I like Garrett Horn a lot. So that would be a day 3, priority guy for me. And so, yeah, if you want a 19th rounder, let's talk Liberty University left-hander Garrett Horn. Maybe Horn ends up going earlier than this, but hey, we're talking 19th rounders here in May. So, we'll just have a little fun with it. But Kevin goes on to say, seriously, what do you think is the strength of the class, of the draft class? High school pitchers, high school hitters, college pitchers, college hitters, etc. I tend to lean that it's college hitters. I think that that's the general consensus of what the draft looks like is a bit more on the college hitter side. It doesn't mean that it's a perfect group, but it seems like it's a decently deep group that you could feel pretty good about getting several guys into your system that work really well. I'll say the high school pitchers might be the second best, though, depending on kind of how you want to view it, because I think there's a really good group of guys that they're not in that like Jackson Jobe, Dylan Lesko before he was hurt, that type of caliber of guys that are just like, these are top 5 players, top 5 pitchers. But that being said, you could still walk away with somebody like Cash Mayfield, Cam Caminiti, Ryan Sloan, William Schmidt. These are really good, talented prep guys that if you wanted to absorb the risk, it's really not that hard to look at things 5-6 years down the line and say that, they're in their second year in the majors. They're throwing really well. This is a mid-rotation or better arm, getting lots of Ks, minimizing the walks. It's really not that difficult to say with that type of profile. And there's kind of a lot of guys that you could say about that. I really love a guy like Desan Hill. He's a left-handed pitcher out of Texas. He's not maybe in that same caliber as some of the guys that I mentioned. Probably a second rounder or like a really high overslot third. Just love the overall profile. There's a fairly deep group of prep pitching, and prep pitching is always going to be where it's like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. What do you, outside of those really rare guys, one a year or something like that, or one every other year, the prep pitchers is usually like, what does your organization develop well? And the Cubs have gambled on especially a lot of left-handed pitchers and there's the building blocks, the foundations that they can develop, and then stuff they need to work on, mechanics, etc., building up arm strength, stuff like that. Folks like Jackson Ferris, Drew Gray, those are the type of profiles that they've looked at. And so I could kind of see something where there's a pretty decent group of second, third round left-handed pitchers. That's probably who I would target. So when we're going back to this, like, what is the strength of the class? I still think it's college hitters, but then there's a really good group of high school arms. It's not legendary. It's not like something that we likely will talk about for 5, 6, 7 years later of like, holy cow, these high school arms were amazing. But I do think that there's a really good group and it's a class that's very fun. So moving on to some of our next questions here. Really do appreciate everybody sending these in. I had one, this kind of targets exactly what we were talking about, which is from Straight Cheddar, Brian, with a few numbers here. I love that handle. That's great. Any chance the Cubs look at any high school pitchers? Absolutely. I'd be shocked if they don't walk away with high school arms. If we're just talking in the top 2 rounds, I still think yes. But obviously, knowing this group, it's still not overly likely that they walk away with a guy like Cash Mayfield or Cam Caminiti or Ryan Sloan or William Schmidt. Probably first round type caliber guys, but they could, and I think that that's certainly within the realm of possibility. When we talk about this draft strategy that the Dan Kantrovitz led Cubs have employed, ultimately we don't know all the conversations that are going on behind the scenes. So I've had folks where they've replied, when I've replied something similar of like, yeah, the Cubs could look at prep pitchers. And the response was, well, they haven't. And it's like, yeah, I know. Like, I'm pretty aware of that. But like, they've drafted in 2020, 21, 22, and 23. 2020 was a pretty weird year. And in 2021, they had Jordan Wicks kind of fall in their lap. They took him. 2022, they clearly liked Cade Horton. Took him. And then 2023, they had Matt Shaw. We're talking 4 years. So I don't think that you can really look at things and say, behind the scenes, the Cubs weren't talking about or weren't identifying that there were prep pitchers that they wanted to take, in the first round. I don't know if there was. I mean, I did hear stuff from outside the organization that there were a couple preps. I'll kind of avoid names at the moment, that they had a lot of the Cubs have been in to see this guy again and again. So, I mean, I think that there's some interest. Hard to know. A few of those guys that I'm talking about, one in particular never even made it to the Cubs last year. So, could they be interested in a prep pitcher? Could they decide that that's worth the risk, that now with where the system is built up and where their risk profile is going and with the depth of like hitters and the need for pitchers, this like next wave of pitchers, could this be the situation where their models happen to lean on upside? Could be. I don't speak with any certainty there, but again, guys like Cash Mayfield, Cam Caminiti, William Schmidt, Ryan Sloan, could be interesting. If we want to talk about guys in the second round, I've got a few here that, I do want to identify and kind of bring up. I mentioned Dasan Hill. I really like him a lot. Left-handed pitcher out of Texas. Let me see here. Joseph or Joey Broughton, another left-handed pitcher, kind of on the East Coast area. Really like him. There's really a group of lefties that I love in that like second to third round range. A lot of fun there. Connor Lehman is a guy that's a little bit deeper. He's another left-handed pitcher. Just folks that, I've looked at their profiles. I've kind of watched the videos. Haven't had the pleasure of seeing them in person. Really like it. I think that there's the building blocks that the Cubs do very well with. And so I would, explore those type of guys. And I think that they're really intriguing. There's certainly some right-handed pitchers as well, but, maybe we'll dive into those a little bit later when we get closer to the draft. Make sure that people are healthy, figure out who's going to likely stay in the draft, talk about those kind of things. So, yeah, do I think the Cubs will target prep pitchers? Absolutely. Be shocked if they don't walk away with at least a decent one. Will they take one in the top 2 rounds? I don't know. I think it makes sense. If I was designing the drafts in a vacuum, I'd probably, just with where it's going, do something like college hitter in round 1, assuming Yesavage isn't on the board, followed by prep pitcher in round 2. That doesn't mean that they have to do that. There's probably a lot of different ways that they could go about it where I'd get on board. But like that could be the style that I would be intrigued with. Another question from Vandy. This is Andrew. Tons of appreciation here on the Discord channel. One of the moderators, great, fantastic to talk baseball with, Vandy. Not a Vanderbilt related question here, but any interesting 3rd to 5th round starting pitcher options similar to Will Sanders last year? Will Sanders is doing pretty well. He had a rough first 2 starts in his debut season this year, or prime debut season this year. After that, it's been really good. Started off in high A, 4th round pick last year by the Cubs. Big fan. One of my favorite picks in the draft last year. He had some kind of first round buzz and just, dealt with some injuries, dealt with some inconsistency, fell to the 4th round. Cubs pounced. Looks like they got a really good one. The 2 guys that I would probably identify first and foremost here, Thatcher Hurd and Matt Ager. And both of those guys really entered with some first round buzz this year. There are probably some situations that have all kind of led to this. But I really buy both of them that if they happen to be in like the 3rd, 4th round, I would jump all over it. Thatcher Hurd, I've been a huge fan of ever since 2021 when he was a high school pitcher. Big fan of that. I think his best years are in front of him. Didn't quite take the leap that we would have anticipated at LSU, but the overall profile is still there. Love it. There's some risk. When you're talking 3rd, 4th, 5th round, honestly, the risk isn't that big a deal. You're still talking about if you feel like there are major league tools, and I think Thatcher Hurd has them. If you think that they can develop in a major league pro development system, in particular the Cubs system, I think Thatcher Hurd can, then that's the type of chance that you take. Matt Ager, as some of the best, I think I read, Joe Doyle put this out on Twitter sometime, but one of the best starter packages. I think it was something related to that. Not difficult to imagine that Matt Ager looks really good at the next level as a starting pitching prospect, needs a lot of development. He's a guy that is a little bit more control and command over stuff, but still a decent arsenal, somebody that needs to build velocity. This is something that the Cleveland Indians used to take all the time, kind of that, don't worry about the ceiling here, but like Shane Bieber, the Cardinals did this with Michael McGreevy. I am in particular and very intentionally bringing up UC Santa Barbara pitchers where Matt Ager pitched. It's a very similar profile. He got shuttered to the bullpen this season for some reason, just kind of ineffectiveness, but I would still take a chance on him in the 3rd and 5th round. I think those are your probably Will Sanders type of blueprints. I could even see a draft, and I believe I will have this one out. Yep. I'm going to be doing 4 sets of 5-round mocks for the Cubs, like one each week. And it'll explore, there's a few crossovers because they're just guys that just fit the profile perfect for what I'm doing for multiple of these mocks. But in general, it's about like 17 different players and how 4 different mock drafts could look with some, this is just purely my guesses, but bonus pools, what these would look like, how we examine the risk, how do we mitigate that risk, how do we look at different things. And there's one draft, spoiler alert, that actually includes both Thatcher Hurd in the 3rd round and Matt Ager in the 4th round. I think it's a really good fit. And that would be kind of my my strategy with that particular draft. So if you're looking for a Will Smith blueprint, that's probably where I would go with that. Moving on here to our next set, we're actually going to be talking about some underslot first, overslot seconds that the Cubs could pursue. All right, so we're going to be kind of treading into some waters related to these 5-round mocks that I'm going to be dropping, and I've got the players kind of picked out, but I think that's just kind of the fun of it. So one of the underslot first rounds that I want to talk about is Vance Honeycutt. He is a center fielder with incredible tools out of UNC. I don't know how I feel about Vance Honeycutt, to be honest. He will show some really, really incredible tools, amazing power, amazing speed, incredible defense. Doesn't make a lot of contact, chases the ball out of the zone. He's had times that he's improved on that, especially last year, but he's dealt with injuries. It's just a really, really risky profile. That being said, if you want to find a guy on the college side at pick 14, and if your goal is to say, we want an all-star, that's probably a really good pick. Like that's a good way to reach that goal, that prospective goal. Because if you feel like you can identify even one area with regard to whiffs and chase, for instance, let's say it's the issue at the top of the zone, which from watching tends to be what I've seen, top of the zone and a little bit on the outside corner, especially breaking balls. If you were to identify and be able to manage the top of the zone, I mean, there's a very good chance that Vance Honeycutt is an all-star. I think with where the Cubs are picking, I would still want to get a haircut. So signing him for like $4 million makes a little bit more sense, because then you can manage that risk throughout the rest of the draft. So Vance Honeycutt would be kind of on the hitting side, maybe where I would look at from an underslot perspective. There's also another pitcher that I think is incredibly fun. The more I watch him, I really kind of buy it. And that's Jurrangelo St. where, and apologies if I mispronounce that, he is a switch pitcher. He will pitch from the left-hand side and the right-hand side. And it's not quite like Pat Verdette, who was the first pro switch pitcher of recent memory, where like he would always switch. He would always pitch from the left side against lefties, the right side against righties, keep that platoon advantage. He will still pitch like righty against some lefties. I ultimately think that is the pathway for him, but I'm pretty impressed with the overall package. I think he still needs some reps. He's kind of a shorter guy. Kind of gives me some like Marcus Stroman vibes as a guy, with maybe kind of a similar build, similar overall kind of profile there. Certainly Marcus Stroman wasn't pitching from the left-hand side. And I will say that St. The left-hand side pitching isn't like a complete novelty. He wouldn't be a first rounder with that. And honestly, there's still some questions about whether he's even a first rounder in general. But I do like the profile. And of this group of second round kind of arms that might pop, St. Ben Hess, Bryce Cunningham, Luke Holman, those are the type of guys that I would kind of watch out for, where the Cubs just really believe in one of these arms. And, we talked about Brody Brecht earlier, but if the Cubs really believe in one of these arms and feel like one of them is SP4, so to speak, so the fourth starting pitcher, on the board. So we've got, in whatever order you want, but like Chase Burns, Hagen Smith, Trey Savage, those are pretty clearly the top three guys. But if a team like the Cubs believe that, one of these others, Holman, St. Hess, Cunningham, is their guy, is their second rounder or the best, I should say the next best college starter, it's not crazy to think that the Cubs take their chances there, take who they believe is the best college arm that's available on the board, and then use that money to funnel into an overslot second. And there's a few different ways that they could go about it. But one of the guys that I really like is Carter Johnson. He is a prep shortstop, probably ends up playing a little bit of second or third base ultimately at the end of the day. Very similar profile to Colt Emerson, with maybe a shade less juice on it. Overall, I really like the profile. I've been a big fan of Carter Johnson for a while now. And I don't know if he ends up as the first round, but boy, I'd love to do something. And again, I have no idea about his ask or anything like that. And I wouldn't talk about it if I did know it. But, maybe save $1 million on slot at 14, use that million plus some of the overage or the senior sign money or whatever at pick 54 to give up right about a $3 million bonus. That would be a tremendous investment, but also a way that you look at something where you anchor that draft with a guy that you feel really good about at 14. Let's say it's a Bryce Cunningham or a Saincha. It doesn't really matter. But if the Cubs feel really good about that guy, this is going to be a mid-rotation starter for us going forward. We know exactly what we need to do with this profile. Let's say it's Bryce Cunningham, who's mostly fastball changeup, at least in where things are setting. We feel like we can teach him a really good slider. We feel like we can teach him a cutter, something like that. And this is a 4-pitch guy, and that's it. We're rolling with it. And then you take that risk, so to speak, at 54, but the upside of another first-round caliber player. It's something the Cubs have done before. 2021 is probably a good example of that, where they're picking later, but they're very convinced on Jordan Wicks, who probably should have gone a little bit higher anyway. You take Jordan Wicks, and then in that particular case, they just absorbed a lot of the money, saved it later, used it for James Triantos. Ultimately, they've got Jordan Wicks as a major league starter. Looks like a pretty decent one. And then they've got James Triantos as top 100 guy pretty easily. 21 years old in Double-A, hitting pretty well, kind of hit a rough spat, but you feel pretty good about his top 75 prospect. That's kind of the same blueprint of what you could do here. So whether it's from the hitting side with a guy like Vance Honeycutt, or it's from the pitching side with maybe like Hess or Holman, Cunningham, Saincha, I think that there's a lot of fun. And in particular, I want to call out Giancarlo Saincha because while I don't think the left-handed pitching is what he ultimately does at the next level, I do feel like that's a risk mitigation strategy. So with him, there's a really good fallback. If something doesn't work out from the right-hand side, you still feel like you get a pretty impressive, or like a decent prospect from the left-hand side. It's more of a reliever at that point, but he still will show some stuff. And if he were to prioritize that, I think he still ends up as a pretty decent reliever. Again, that's not your goal at 14 by any stretch of the imagination. But if you end up getting it as your backup option, that's not the end of the world. I think so. I could see Saincha actually being really interesting from purely like a risk mitigation standpoint. So I like him. I think he's really good. He would be a guy I would target. Is it in the first round? I don't know. But also, does he even make it to 54? I don't know that either. And I can see a team looking at his profile and saying, this is the 4th best college arm. Some folks are probably standing up screaming right now, but Brody Brecht. And I understand that. But if you were an organization that, and I don't know how the Cubs feel on this, but if you happen to be convinced that Brody Brecht is a reliever going forward due to the command issues, then on one's model, it's not crazy to see a guy like Saincha or Hess, who definitely has some questions, Holman, Cunningham, having this view of like, but if we feel he is a starter and we feel like we can identify those areas to improve, being higher on the board than Brecht, teams are going to feel probably very different on this. I put out a question on Twitter, X, whatever we're calling it, that was like, who's your best, 4th best starting pitcher in the college side? And I got so many different answers, many of which are the ones that I talked about today, but so many different answers. And I can imagine teams are going to feel very differently about this as well. So those are maybe some ideas that one could go about, some hitting side, some underslot deals or overslot deals. A guy that I've seen a lot that I don't want to get into too much, Tyson Lewis. He is a shortstop in the Nebraska, Omaha area. Fantastic dude. I've been really impressed watching him. Not going to go into it too much, but, he is a guy that maybe could fit that profile as well. would be a lot of fun. Very similar to Carter Johnson in the sense that just shows off some very impressive tools. Does it in a little bit of a different way. Certainly some more pull side stuff, but some very impressive work that both of those shortstops have done. I love targeting high school shortstops in the second round, even in the first round. I think it's a great demographic to invest in for an organization. And so, I love that, certainly. So with that said, we're going to keep this one to an hour. This was a ton of fun. I love draft. I appreciate everybody's flexibility. I've been coughing like crazy. These allergies are absolutely killer here at this time. But this was a ton of fun. Let's talk MLB draft again. Next time we talk, that will be just a strictly MLB draft episode. I will probably have all 4 of my 5-round mocks out, along with, I'm pretty sure, my next mock draft for a 2024 season. So I think it's 2.0. Been kind of asking around on different teams, getting a sense for where things are sitting. I think it's going to be fun. It's still a little in flux, certainly when we get around the Cubs range, but it could be a lot of fun as we get into the regionals, super regionals. Host sites are coming out now. I'm getting messages about it right now. People are surprised on where things are going. By the time you're hearing this, all of our NCAA regional sites and assignments will be out. That'll be out on Selection Monday. You're going to get this on the Tuesday, but I'm catching it live. So we've got folks that are already kind of interested in where teams are going. And so it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm excited to cover the rest of the draft cycle for you. As a reminder of where we're kind of sitting, we just finished kind of conference championships. We're moving into regionals the week after super regionals. And then after that, amazing baseball, the College World Series. If you're interested in the MLB draft, that is an amazing week and a half, 2 weeks, because not only do we get the College World Series, we get a little bit of the MLB draft combine. So tons of MLB draft. Happy to bring you some coverage there. Some more live looks from Omaha. Be on the look for my live looks from Omaha for the Big Ten Championship. That should be out this week as well. But overall, it is going to be a big MLB draft for the Chicago Cubs. With where the organization is sitting, it's huge. So if you're interested or just kind of diving into the draft, now's the time to jump into it. Let's get excited. Let's jump into these things, jump into these profiles. This is the next wave of the next great Cubs team. That's what you always hope for. So with that, you can follow me on Twitter, X, Blue Sky, Threads. I'm not great about those, but I do try to post every once in a while. And my handle is usually related to @IvyFutures. Additionally, I talk a lot of baseball on the 1060 West Discord. If you want an invite, shoot me a message. I'm happy to do that. We keep that group somewhat small, nice, tight. Great to talk baseball, though. Very respectful place to talk baseball. People can disagree, and we do so respectfully. But we can have some really good discussions and debates on there. So if you want an invite to that, please reach out to me on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it. With that, it's great. Let's talk MLB draft next time. Very excited to talk with you. And you know what? Go Cubs.